In this video, I talk about how you shouldn't fudge dice. Instead, you should just ask your players to roll less. Welcome to Tabletop Sandbox, where we talk about all things TTRPG. Out of the night that covers me, black is the pit from pole to pole. I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade. And yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Also known as Harrison Tar. So, dice fudging. What is it? Well, if you're unfamiliar, it is the practice of the game master or dungeon master or warden or keeper or whatever it is called in your game, of rolling the dice, seeing the result, deciding they don't like that result for whatever reason, and arbitrarily choosing a new result that they like better. There have been many discussions on whether or not this is okay, or is it technically cheating, or should the GM do it or only do it in certain circumstances, or not at all. It's been covered. The two most common reasons that you would fudge dice are to prevent a character death or even a total party kill, or to railroad your players, basically ensuring a specific outcome that you have decided is going to happen beforehand. This enemy is really tough and has to beat your players, and so if your players are doing really good, then hey, why not add an extra 15 to all the bad guys' rolls? I'm going to talk about why you shouldn't fudge dice, and better than that, I'm going to tell you how to avoid situations where you would even want to. First of all, fudging dice steals your player's agency, which is a big no-no, as agency is one of the things that makes this game different and better than any other type of game you could play. I have an entire video about player agency that I will link in the description below. And this doesn't apply to just negatively influencing your player's agency. It could also influence your player's agency in a way that you are taking it away to ensure that they don't get killed. You might have the best intentions when you fudge dice, but that doesn't mean that it's okay. I would argue that fudging dice I would argue that fudging dice is actually immoral. And let me explain why. First, it creates false expectations. Your players come to this game and they're expecting a fair scenario. Sure, you made up all the other stuff, but at least the dice. The dice are what's reliable. The dice are reliably random, that is. You don't know whether your roll or the GM's roll is going to be good or bad, and that adds an aspect of excitement and random chance and the idea of putting your fate into the hands of a random generator. Matt Colville has a great video about fudging dice, which you can check out in the description below. Don't get me wrong, I understand that it is the game master's job to keep secrets from the players, at least in some aspects. I'm starting to be introduced to this idea that you should saturate your players with information and then allow them to make decisions with all that information, which is kind of a theory or method of play big in the OSR. But you do have to keep that villain's motivation secret until the players find a document or overhear a conversation that reveals them. Part of that is maintaining verisimilitude, which is another big part of this game, making it believable. So I'm not saying that GMs should never deceive their players or keep anything a secret and should always roll in the open. But I am saying that there's a difference between lying and keeping secrets. If you're rolling the dice behind the screen, there's an insinuation that you are taking the result that turns up on that die. It's part of the unspoken or maybe even spoken agreement at your table. You go with what the dice say. I'll restate the common argument about fudging dice. If you're not going to use the result that comes up on the die, why even use them at all? And I would agree with that, but I understand that there are circumstances where it becomes difficult to do that. And I'm going to address how you solve that problem. So what happens if you've made a terrible mistake as a game master, and the outcome that looks likely is going to be really bad for your players, or just not fun? Maybe an enemy you've created turns out to be way more powerful than you expected and is laying waste to your players in a way that really wouldn't make for a dramatic TPK. Maybe it's something that you just kind of hand-waved and said, yeah, sure. Either letting your players do something, or just an aspect of the world or the story that you didn't think was important now suddenly is important, and you realize you made a mistake when you made that random call. Well, the first step, as always, is to communicate clearly. If it's a super powerful enemy and you don't want to fiddle with the stats or the hit points or damage dice of that enemy, telegraph it to your players. Say, ooh, this guy is way more powerful than I initially expected. And remind your players that running is always a valid option. It's okay to reveal that. Some secrets are good, but sometimes by keeping information from your players, you're just setting them up for disappointment. Make sure you communicate clearly that what they're up against is way too powerful for them to reasonably deal with, and then they get to make the decision of, do we stay and try to pull off this incredible feat of daring and bravery, or do we tuck our tail between our legs and run to fight another day? Now, you as the GM kind of have to make the decision to be reasonable and not have that super powerful monster chase after your players. Though, I guess you could, but if this is to fix a mistake you made in the first place, then maybe don't beat your players over the head with your own bad game design. The other option for my you hand-waved how magic works example is to just communicate and retcon. Instead of having them in that situation and figuring out where they go from there, realize that decision I made a while back doesn't actually make any sense now, and if I allowed it to continue like this, the whole thing would fall apart and it wouldn't really be fun for anybody because the verisimilitude of the world is shattered. Communicate that to your players. Don't just keep it in here. Once you realize it, say, hold on guys, I made a mistake. Can we just fix that and say, all right, this is how this works now that I've given it some thought and I have a reasonable way that magic should work in this world. If you ask them that and give them an explanation and explain your reasoning, trust me, your players are gonna be cool with it. They're all here to have a good time, and hopefully they want you to have a good time too. So just talk it out and say, all right, this thing would break the game, let's fix it. Though maybe your players will come to you and provide an alternate point of view and be like, no, actually what you created is super fun for us. Can we just run with this? And then you as the game master have to decide, do I let the way I designed my world kind of fall to the back burner? Or do I let the way I imagined my world kind of drift into nothingness and let this new reality that I've accidentally created but is super fun for my players take over? Or do you say, no, I have things in mind for this world that would really just not work if I allowed this kind of magical malarkey to continue? Another strategy for dealing with what to do when your players are up against a situation that is really bad for them and is heading towards an outcome that either wouldn't make sense or would just not be any fun is to stop calling for rolls and just decide what happens. Now, this is in the rules of D&D and most other role-playing games. It is the game master's job to decide when to call for a roll. The players don't get to decide when they roll. Only the game master decides this. So if you have a player who goes up to the ancient dragon at first level and says, I'm going to stab this dragon and begin a combat, and you know that this combat is only going to end one way, an option is to let that combat play out, TPK your players, and then maybe nobody has a great night. It is your responsibility as the game master to decide whether you call for an attack roll and initiative and you put this party of level 1 adventurers into a combat with this ancient dragon that is inevitably going to wipe them all out? Or instead do you decide to narrate that your player's sword just bounces off the scales of this ancient dragon, the dragon reaches up, flicks that player with one claw, and knocks them unconscious? That is a decision that you can make as a game master. That player that decided to attack the dragon might feel like you're stealing their agency, and you are in a sense, but really what you're doing is you're protecting the agency of all the other players in the party. You're not resigning them to this inevitably ended fight, and you're just showing that this dragon is a far too powerful enemy for them to come up against and have any hope of succeeding. And when that dragon knocks the attacker or would-be attacker unconscious, you don't even have to drop them to 0 hit points. So personally, I would, to at least punish them a tiny bit for making such a brain-dead decision. But the second you call for a roll, the second you decide, okay, it's combat, then you kind of tangled yourself into this rules of combat, and you have to play it out in order to be fair. Don't put yourself in a situation where you have to either fudge the rolls of the dragon so he doesn't just immediately destroy all the players, or you have to just kill all your players because one of them made a bad decision. Basically, what I'm saying is, if calling for a roll would result in an unacceptable outcome, do not call for that roll. Decide what happens instead. And this could be something like that fight with the dragon, or it could be something as simple as you need to solve this puzzle or cross this gap or bust through this door to progress the adventure, to progress the story. If you have this wall that must be surpassed in order to go on with the quest, do not require a roll that could be failed to push you forward into that goal. If you have a puzzle, don't require a roll, make your players figure it out. Or if they can't, bring along an NPC to help them with it. But don't put yourself in a situation where a failed roll stalls the entire adventure. The 3 circumstances that I would potentially advise that you use this tact of not calling for a roll or refusing a roll that your players ask for is if it would result in the death of a PC, if it halts progress forward, like I gave the example of doors or chasms or something like that, or if it would break the verisimilitude of your world, like somebody attempting to kind of finagle or ruse lawyer a use of a spell that really just wouldn't make sense. If somebody wants to use a spell in a way that wouldn't work or would break the way magic works in your world, don't call for an Arcana roll. Just tell them no. Now, not rolling for things is not how Dungeons & Dragons 5e is designed. You roll to achieve everything, or most everything. It's kind of a weird system where nobody ever sets a DC below 10 because that's too easy, and so if something is easy, you don't actually have to roll for it, which is kind of the right way to run a role-playing game, but not how the rules of D&D tell you to run it. But it goes beyond that. I'm saying that you should roll actually a whole lot less when it comes to running D&D or any other RPG. And I know for you 5e purists, that might be a drastic change to your playstyle, and that can be difficult, but I would ask you to consider adopting these practices when you run a game of D&D or any TTRPG. Like I mentioned earlier, give more info freely up front. Let your players make decisions with the information that would be available to those characters in the world. When it comes to rolling investigation, only request that roll if they don't need that information to continue. This one is a big step, and it wouldn't necessarily work with 5e, but it's how the game that I talked about in my earlier video, Cairn, works. It's to only roll saves. In Cairn, you don't roll checks. You only roll saves. What this means is you're not rolling to achieve anything, you're only rolling to avoid the negative consequences of the actions that you decide to take. This also means giving your players more without requiring rolls from them. Let good ideas that they have be enough. Don't force them to succeed on a roll in order to achieve anything. If they have a good idea and it's something that they'd reasonably be able to achieve without suffering any negative consequences, just let them do it. That's one of the greatest things that you can do as a player, is have an idea so good that your GM is like, yeah, that just works. Now, this next point, Matt Colville also did an entire video about, which will also be in the description below, but it's the idea that every role should push the story forward, or at least the player character's progress forward. And that applies whether or not the role is a success or a failure. If every role is only to avoid negative consequences, then that means they achieve what they set out to achieve, but if they fail, then there's a negative side effect. Or you could use something like the Powered by Apocalypse games, where if they fail, you can give them a choice, whether it's like, okay, you can do that, but it will be at this cost. I like the idea of improv, which is what these games are a lot of, which is the yes and. But if your role is a success, give your players a yes and result. If it is a failure, give your players a yes but result. That's an interesting way to keep the story moving forward, but also have consequences for roles. I know that took a few tangents and went all over the place, but I hope you were able to parse it, and if you did, that you found something interesting about it, and maybe you have some new techniques to try the next time you run your game. If you disagree with anything I've said, or that my soul is unconquerable, leave a comment below and I'll tell you why you're wrong. Thank you so much for watching, and good night, mortals.